Here's what no one tells you about the men who are hardest to leave. They don't start out looking like a problem. They start out looking like the answer. And somewhere between the first moment everything felt right and the moment you realized something was deeply off, the psychology of your own brain had already been working against you. This video is about that gap, what fills it, and what it costs you when you don't see it clearly. Let's start with a question that has genuinely puzzled behavioral researchers for decades. Why do intelligent, self-aware, capable women stay in relationships that are clearly damaging them? Because here's what the data actually shows. Women who stay in harmful relationships are not, on average, less educated, less emotionally aware, or less capable of rational thinking. Many of them can articulate, in precise detail, exactly what is wrong. They know. So why don't they leave? That's the question this video is designed to answer, not with judgment, but with science. Because the truth is far more interesting than the simple explanation most people offer. The answer isn't weakness. It isn't a lack of intelligence. And it isn't love, at least, not exactly. It's the way the human brain responds to a very specific pattern of reward and uncertainty. A pattern that certain relationship dynamics produce almost by design. And once you understand that mechanism, everything about these relationships starts to make a completely different kind of sense. To understand what's happening, we need to start with a concept from behavioral psychology called intermittent reinforcement. In the 1950s, psychologist B.F. Skinner ran a series of experiments examining how different reward schedules affect behavior. What he found was counterintuitive and deeply important. When a reward is given consistently, every single time a behavior occurs, the behavior is easy to acquire and equally easy to give up. You stop getting the reward, you stop the behavior. But when a reward is given unpredictably, sometimes, not always, with no clear pattern, the behavior becomes almost impossible to extinguish. The subject keeps trying, keeps working, keeps hoping, long after a reasonable observer would have walked away. This is why slot machines are more addictive than predictable games. The uncertainty is the mechanism. The brain doesn't just respond to the reward, it becomes obsessed with pursuing it. Now apply that to a relationship. A man who is inconsistently kind, affectionate one week, cold the next, attentive then suddenly distant, is, from a neurological standpoint, operating like a slot machine. The warm moments don't just feel good. They produce a disproportionate dopamine response precisely because they're unpredictable. You aren't addicted to him. You're addicted to the pattern. This is not a metaphor. Research building on John Bowlby's foundational attachment theory from the 1960s shows that inconsistent caregiving, in childhood and in adult relationships, activates the same anxiety bonding mechanism. The brain reads uncertainty as urgency. It prioritizes resolving the inconsistency over evaluating the relationship itself. That's the foundation. And it explains why the first type of man on this list is also the most difficult to leave. Psychologists and therapists who work with relationship patterns have identified specific types of men whose behavior consistently creates this kind of harmful bonding cycle. Not because these men are monsters, most aren't, but because their behavior triggers deeply wired psychological responses in their partners. The first type is the man who is inconsistently good. He doesn't mistreat you constantly. That would actually make leaving easier. Instead, he cycles, warmth, then distance, then warmth again. Affection that feels earned after a period of emotional withdrawal. This is intermittent reinforcement in action. And the brain, wired by millions of years of evolution to pursue uncertain rewards, keeps chasing. The research here is consistent. Psychologist Donald Dutton's work on coercive control in intimate partnerships found that cycles of tension, conflict, and reconciliation created attachment bonds that participants described as stronger than their bonds in stable, healthy relationships. The unpredictability, paradoxically, intensified the connection. The second type is the man who makes you doubt your own perception. This is what psychologists call gaslighting. A pattern of psychological manipulation in which one partner systematically undermines the other's confidence in their own memory, judgment, and emotional responses. You're overreacting. That's not what happened. You're too sensitive. Said once, these are dismissals. Said consistently, over months or years, they erode the very cognitive foundation you would need to recognize that something is wrong and to trust yourself enough to act on it. Research in cognitive psychology shows that our sense of reality is more social than most people realize. We calibrate our perceptions against the responses of people we trust. A partner who consistently frames your valid reactions as irrational is slowly dismantling your ability to trust your own mind. The third type is the man who is self-aware but not self-correcting. This is perhaps the most sophisticated trap of all. He knows he's flawed. He tells you so, openly, often early in the relationship. I have a lot of baggage. I've hurt people before. I'm not sure I'm capable of what you deserve. This creates a powerful illusion. We tend to associate self-awareness with the capacity for change. If he can see the problem, surely he can fix it? But awareness without consistent behavioral change is not growth. It's disclosure. And in some cases, it functions as a preemptive defense, a way of lowering your expectations while maintaining your emotional investment. Behavioral psychologist Daniel Kahneman identified a cognitive pattern he called substitution. When a difficult question is too hard to answer, the brain quietly replaces it with an easier one. The question, will he actually change, is hard. The question, does he know he needs to, is easy. And the brain uses the easier answer to satisfy the harder question. He knows. So surely, with enough time and love, he will. He may not. The fourth type is the man who only appears when you're about to disappear. He is emotionally absent until you reach your limit. The moment you pull back, he reappears. Calls, messages, grand gestures, promises. This is not love reactivating. This is what attachment researchers call avoidant bonding. The avoidant partner connects only when the threat of loss triggers enough anxiety to override their default emotional distance. The cruel irony is that this can feel like confirmation the connection is real, that your patience has finally paid off. But the pattern almost always repeats. Remove the threat, and the distance returns. Here is the part most people in this conversation don't want to hear. Knowing all of this, understanding the psychology, being able to name the patterns, does not automatically protect you from them. In fact, in some cases, naming the pattern can make it harder to leave. Because once you have a clinical explanation for why he behaves the way he does, your brain now has a framework that feels like understanding. And understanding can masquerade as acceptance. He's avoidantly attached, can become a reason to stay and manage around his limitations, rather than a reason to evaluate whether those limitations are compatible with the life you actually want. Knowledge is necessary, but it is not sufficient. The deeper force at work in many of these relationships is what trauma researchers call trauma bonding. Judith Herman, in her foundational work on trauma and recovery, described the paradox of an attachment that intensifies under conditions of intermittent harm rather than diminishing. The greater the cycle of tension and relief, the stronger the psychological bond. This is not unique to dramatic cases of overt abuse. It appears across a spectrum of harmful relationship dynamics, from emotional manipulation to chronic inconsistency to periodic emotional withdrawal. The brain under these conditions begins to function somewhat like a brain in early addiction. The stress hormones released during conflict, cortisol, adrenaline, are followed by the relief and dopamine of reconciliation. Over time, the brain begins to associate that relief not with the relationship being good, but with the conflict resolving. The partner becomes the source of both the wound and the cure. And that dual role is profoundly difficult to separate. This also explains two of the most common responses people have when they observe these relationships from the outside. The first is frustration. Why doesn't she just leave? Because leaving means giving up the person who also provides the relief. The brain cannot easily distinguish between "he makes me feel terrible" and "he is the only one who makes me feel better after I feel terrible." The second is the almost universal pattern of return. Research on harmful relationships consistently shows that leaving is rarely a single event. It is a process, often involving multiple attempts. This is not weakness. It is the nature of bonding under these conditions. And then there is loss aversion. Kahneman's research documented the well-established human tendency to feel potential losses roughly twice as powerfully as equivalent gains. Leaving a long-term relationship, even a harmful one, activates this system fully. What you're losing feels enormous. What you might gain feels abstract. The sunk cost fallacy compounds it. Years invested. A shared life constructed. A future already imagined. The brain does not easily abandon investments. Even when continuing to invest, is irrational. This is not a character flaw. It is a documented feature of human cognition, one that requires active, deliberate effort to override. This is where it becomes personal. Because here is the thing about these patterns. They don't usually announce themselves. They don't arrive in your life labeled as what they are. They arrive as chemistry, as intensity, as feeling understood in a way you haven't felt before. And by the time the pattern is visible, the attachment is already formed. So the question isn't only, how do I recognize these men? The question is also, what does recognizing them cost me? And am I willing to pay that cost? Because leaving someone your brain is bonded to, even someone who is harming you, feels like loss. Real loss. That feeling is not a sign that you're wrong. It's a sign that you're human. Here is what behavioral research is consistent about over time. Early patterns in a relationship are dramatically more predictive of long-term outcomes than the chemistry of the early stage or the promises made during it. Psychologist John Gottman's decades of research on couples, work that could predict long-term relationship outcomes with striking accuracy, identified not dramatic events, but subtle, consistent patterns as the clearest indicators. Contempt was the single strongest predictor of relationship failure. Not conflict, not incompatibility in interests or habits. Contempt, a consistent, low-level communication that the other person is beneath you. And contempt doesn't always look like yelling. It looks like dismissiveness, an eye roll, a tone that says your feelings are inconvenient. You're always doing this. Why are you like this? The accumulation of many small moments in which your inner experience is treated as excessive, wrong, or simply in the way. There is also something researchers call the normalization of dysfunction. When a person is exposed to a consistent but gradually escalating set of behaviors, the threshold for what registers as unacceptable quietly shifts. What would have been clearly identified as wrong at the start of the relationship becomes ordinary, expected, even familiar, in the way that something uncomfortable can become familiar. This happens without conscious awareness. And it has a measurable long-term cost on mental health, on self-worth, and on the ability to accurately evaluate future relationships. Studies examining the long-term effects of prolonged exposure to emotionally invalidating relationships, even without physical abuse, consistently document elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and what some researchers describe as a diminished capacity for self-trust. The instrument you use to evaluate reality has been calibrated against a distorted standard for long enough that recalibrating it takes real, sustained effort. This is not permanent, but it is real, and it points to something important. Leaving is not the end of the work. In many ways, it's the beginning. Because the patterns that made certain relationships feel familiar, even comfortable, often have their roots in experiences that came long before this one. That is not blame. It is information. And information, used clearly, is the starting point for something different. Let's come back to where we started. The question was, why do intelligent, self-aware women stay in relationships that are clearly damaging them? 3 things to take with you. First, the brain is not a neutral observer of your relationships. It is an active participant, wired to pursue inconsistent rewards, to bond under conditions of intermittent stress and relief, and to resist giving up investments, emotional or otherwise. Understanding this is not an excuse. It's a starting point. Second, the most dangerous patterns in relationships are rarely the dramatic ones. They're the subtle, consistent ones. The slow erosion of your confidence in your own perceptions. The gradual normalization of behavior that should have been a clear signal early on. Pay attention to patterns, not isolated incidents. And pay attention to how you feel after time with him, not just during the best moments, but consistently, over time. Third, recognizing a pattern and leaving because of it are 2 different cognitive events. They are both necessary, and neither one is instant. Leaving, truly leaving, in the sense of disengaging not just physically but psychologically, is a process. One that may require support, and one that deserves the same patience and grace that you have been extending for too long in the wrong direction. There is a question that therapists sometimes use as a clarity tool, not as a prescription, but as a lens. If you knew, with certainty, that this person would not change in any meaningful way over the next 12 months, if the version of him you have right now is the version that stays, would you still choose this? Not the version you're hoping for, not the version he is during the best days. The consistent, everyday version. If the answer is no, the next question isn't, how do I make him change? It's, what would I need in myself to believe I deserve something better than this? That's where it starts. If this gave you something useful to think about, subscribe. We publish psychology-based content every week, designed to help you understand yourself and the people around you more clearly. The next video is already waiting, and it takes this conversation somewhere you might not expect.